All right, something I just simply left out, but it's got a 50-50 chance of being on your test. But I really wanted to include was Pythagoras. Now, if any of you have taken a geometry class, you've run into this thing, Pythagoras. Also, Euclid. I better put him down too. Euclid is said to be the father of geometry. But anyway, Pythagoras is famous for his Pythagorean theorem. The theorem goes like this: a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now, you might not expect to see that in a history class. I just got another part-time faculty. History covers every area of the universe. All right. How many of you have run into this before? I mean, by any chance? Very few hands. 3 hands went up. 4, 5. Okay, 6. All right. Basically, a squared, like if the one side is 3 and the other side is 4, I'm going to have a right triangle. All right, you have a right triangle. This side is 3 and this side is 4. What will the length of the hypotenuse be? 5. 3, 4, 5. 3 squared is 9 plus 16 equals 25. The square root of 25 is 5. A squared, b squared, c squared. Again, Pythagorean theorem. It's all part of geometry. Euclid is said to be the founder of geometry. All right, make sure you get it. There is at least one question on a test, but I can't guarantee that you'll get it with the other class will. But I was looking over the test the other day. I did not go over this in class. All right. Now, back to Rome. Rome built up its wealth by defeating a city-state and then telling that state, hey, be our ally, furnish troops for us, and help us conquer another city, and we'll build a road to you. And after a while, the other cities got to where they liked being ruled by Rome. For one thing, it kept the peace. And for another, the richer Rome got, the richer they got. So they would build roads to Rome and trade with Rome, and Rome in turn would guarantee that they would not be attacked, because if they were attacked, that would give Rome an excuse to go to war with the city that attacked them. Rome began to, they used diplomacy, opportunism, persistence, and they placed forts in strategic locations, all in an attempt to build up their strength throughout Italy. And it took a generation or two, but after a while, Rome had all of Italy. A lot of people believe they did not plan it, maybe didn't even intend to, but they got all of Italy. And now, we don't know much about what life was like under their kings because there were no written records, but their written records, or the original sources, begin with Rome under the Republic. Under the Republic, Rome was at first governed by consuls. There were 2 consuls. Each had equal power, and each had the power to stop the other if one of them didn't like what the other one was doing. The idea was, we're not going to have another king. See, they were determined to not be ruled by one person. Now, we're going to find that in spite of all their attempts to make sure that no one person took over, wound up one person did take over, namely the emperor, and eventually the emperors became hereditary. But the consuls would govern Rome, would lead armies in wartime, and would administer the peace in peacetime. They had a senate who were the advisors of the consuls. The senate consisted of 300 men, not like the Greeks who had a council of 500, 300 men who would advise the consuls. Now, one of the things that Rome did not have, I had a student do a paper on this one time. They never defined clearly what authority each office had. Now, in our Constitution, it spells out, and I've read it, the president shall have power And it says Congress shall have power. And our Constitution spells out the president is to serve a term of 4 years. And eventually we wrote into the Constitution that he can only be elected 2 times. It would serve a maximum of 8 years. He can serve 10 if he fills in for another president for less than half of the other president's term. But he's, and our senators serve for 6 years. But in those days, they did not really define what each office held. It would be like being in the Army. And over here, the rank of major means this, but over here, about 50 miles away, there's another man with a rank of major, and it means that. But nobody knows what each rank entails. That's basically what they had. They did not have a written constitution that actually defined what these offices were. And an office might mean one thing to one generation, then this office would generate to where all the person who did it was perform ceremonies, what's called ceremonial functions. And a lot of people believe this was eventually to lead to the downfall of the Republic and eventually the downfall of Rome itself. They did not really clearly define the power of each office or the role each official was to hold. But during the time we were under the Republic, a class struggle ensued. Now, this term, every time I think of class struggle, I think of Karl Marx. Karl Marx said that all of history was nothing but one big, long, unending class struggle. He was taking part of the truth and making it the whole truth. Yes, there have been class struggles, but class struggles are not all there is throughout history. But they had the upper classes, the patrician class. These were the wealthy. At the bottom were the plebeians. These were the majority, and these were the poor. Patrician and plebeian clashed. They had laws that patricians were not allowed to marry plebeians and so forth. The patricians eventually became the nobles. And these nobles used their wealth to gain even more wealth and to intimidate those who stood in their way. Now, eventually, the plebeians, the patricians realized they needed the plebeians to fight their wars. They needed the plebeians to grow their crops and perform services. So eventually they gave the plebeians more rights, including the right of plebeian women, or plebeians to intermarry with patricians. Also, the plebeians were allowed to set up 2 officials called tribunes. These tribunes had veto power. In other words, if the tribunes did not like a law that the Senate passed, they could veto it. And if they didn't like a law the consuls passed, they could veto it also. Now again, they had a little conflict here because nobody knew who exactly had the power to make new laws. And in our own country, we have the same thing. Our Constitution never said that the Supreme Court can make a law. It's not there for it. Yet our Supreme Court is making laws right and left, contrary to the possible intent of the original writers of the Constitution. Well, this eventually was to lead to a clash. It was to bring the whole system down. Will the same thing happen to the United States? Well, a lot of persons point out there's a lot of parallels. The United States has the presidents and governors have veto power. The United States has a Senate. The United States has Capitol domes. And the United States is a republic, so much like Rome. The United States once had a king whom we rebelled against, just like Rome. Will the United States follow in the footsteps of the Roman Empire? By the way, that was the very first term paper I ever did in high school. Our teacher gave us some topics to pick from, and I picked the topic, is the United States following in the footsteps of the Roman Empire? I said it was, but I could rewrite that paper today with a whole lot more data than I understand, because in the 50 years since I wrote that paper, about 48, 50 years or so since I wrote it, there's been a whole lot happened that had not happened then. All right. Now, inevitably, Rome came, yes?
So you said the tribunes, they can veto?
They were of the plebeian class. They were appointed by the plebeians, and there were 2 of them. And they had the power to veto laws that they felt like would hurt the plebeians. Now, eventually, like I say, Rome gave it free for the patricians to marry plebeians and vice versa. Plebeians, women could marry patrician men or vice versa. eventually the class distinctions became a little bit less pronounced. Now, when Rome was conquering Italy, they were conquering a group of people who spoke the Latin language, who worshiped the same gods, and who were a lot like the Romans anyway. Once they got all of Italy, they were inevitably going to bump into some people who were not like them. The city of Carthage. Now, Carthage was located across the Mediterranean Sea from Italy in North Africa, and it was quite a large city, and they had built up a huge empire that included almost all of North Africa except for Egypt. But it included all the western, all of what is today Libya and Morocco. And they also had Sicily. Now this led to the conflict known as the Punic Wars. Now, all right, to sum up, folks, give a summary of the Punic War. There were actually 3 of them. They occurred over a period of 100 years. That is, they were fought from one generation to the next. And they eventually led to Rome doing something it had not done to the other cities it had conquered. Rome wound up completely destroying Carthage, putting salt in the ground of where it could never be resalted, burning the city to the ground. I mean, that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Because the people of Carthage were people, unlike the Italians, the Carthagins simply could not be reconciled, could not form any kind of an agreement that would last. Now, part of it was religious. Carthage worshipped different gods than the Romans. And in preparation for my master's final, I read a book about the Punic Wars, and it included a lot of description of Carthage. Carthage's religion. All right, these Punic Wars, though, you might think just another group of ancient wars. They actually were to determine the whole course of Western civilization. The Carthage religion involved a whole lot of Wicca, or what we might call witchcraft, mind control. Things that the Roman religion was beginning to frown on. If Carthage had won the Punic Wars, Western civilization and the whole course of all of history might have been changed, and not necessarily for the better. We might not sit in an air-conditioned classroom with electric lights. We might not have automobiles. Because, to me, Carthage's religion was guaranteed to keep the people primitive and guaranteed to not bring forth inventions and innovations. Now, again, I can't prove that. That's pure speculation. But Carthage's religion, again, comes across to me as being somewhat primitive, and Rome's religion a little bit more advanced and a little bit more capable of taking them to higher levels than was possible under the witchcraft, mind control of the Carthage religion. Be that as it may, another feature of Carthage, though, is they could not be placated. Rome was fighting against a group of people who, as long as they existed, they were going to keep coming back. As long as they were there, they were going to keep fighting. And they would keep fighting, and they would keep fighting. And finally, the only way to get them to stop fighting was to take them all out of the city and kill a bunch of them and enslave the rest, scatter them all over the Roman Empire, and burn the city to the ground. Now, how much of that applies to today, I'm going to leave you to decide for yourself. But this is one case in history where an advanced civilization fought against a civilization that was more primitive, and the more primitive civilization would simply not quit fighting. All right, the first war, First Punic War, was fought over Sicily. Sicily lay between Rome. Sicily is an island, and on a map it looks like Italy is a woman with a high-heeled shoe, and it looks like this high-heeled shoe is kicking Sicily. Anyway, Sicily is an island. Carthage claimed it, Rome claimed it. They fought a war about it. The first war went to Rome, and Carthage was defeated. Well, like I've already mentioned, Carthage did not take that lying down. Carthage then went into Spain, conquered Spain, and they used this to launch the Second Punic War. Now the Second War featured one of the greatest military leaders of all time in the person of Hannibal. Hannibal had a brother named Hasdrubal. Hannibal knew that he was fighting against bigger numbers than he had, and against a civilization that had more on the ball than his. Nevertheless, he managed to harass Rome for some 20 years. He went into southern France with a bunch of elephants, and from southern France he crossed the Alps to get into Italy. In other words, the Romans were not prepared for invading from Italy. They were watching the seacoast and thinking he invaded the sea. Instead, he invaded from the Alps, the northern part of Italy, came down, and once in Italy, he harassed Italy for 20 years. He never would risk a really decisive battle, knowing he probably couldn't win. And instead, he figured out where the Romans were weakest, and he hit them at the weak point. And before the Roman army had a chance to get to him there, he'd move on to the next place. And he hit him again at the weak point. And this went on for some 20 years. One of the battles, though, he did fight was a battle of Cunae. Essentially, I'm going to try to draw it, folks. See if you can see what's about to happen. Right at Cunae, the two sides met. Hannibal ordered his center. This is Hannibal, and this was Rome. Hannibal ordered his center to just simply slowly and gradually fall back and make as if they were beaten, but the wings to hold tight, the flanks. Well, what happened after a while? The formation began to look like this, with the Romans advancing in the center, and this was proved to be a big mistake. The Romans thought, hey, we're winning, at least our center's advancing. Well, the center fell back even farther. You might be about to guess what's to happen. As the center fell back farther and the wings held steady, eventually the wings just closed in on the Romans. That's not drawn this scale. The wings closed in, the Romans found themselves surrounded in front and behind, and the Romans were using a hope-like type of formation in. The Roman soldiers, like the Greeks, only wore armor on their front. They didn't protect their backs. They felt like we don't need you, and also it could encourage soldiers to not retreat. Right? As long as you have no protection on your back, you don't want to turn around when your back is exposed. But this time, Hannibal's army had gotten behind the Romans, and they slaughtered every Roman soldier on the field, just simply because they had outmaneuvered and got to the rear. This was the Battle of Cunae. I'm not going to write that, well, no, I'm not going to write that down. But it was a battle where that Hannibal won by outmaneuvering the Romans. This type of fighting was to go on for 20 years. It was like mostly guerrilla type tactics. Again, the type of tactics that people use who don't have much of a chance to win. But finally, a Roman general named Scipio decided, hey, he's been harassing us. I know what I'll do. There's no significant army there in Carthage. I'm going to send my army to Carthage, and we're going to fight Carthage. When Hannibal realized that Scipio was on his way to Carthage, he had to leave Italy and go home and defend Carthage. So he went to Carthage himself, and Scipio and Hannibal met. Now, this time Scipio outplanned him on the second front. All right, he got Hannibal away from Italy. All right, that was the first big move. Then he realized, now here's what Hannibal will do. He's going to send a charge of elephants at me. But I'm going to tell my troops that when the elephants charge, do the unthinkable, break ranks, and form a path for the elephants. I don't know that this actually happened, but I can imagine one of his soldiers. But sir, I have been fighting for 20 years and I've never broken ranks. And I said, listen, this time, I'm your captain, you break ranks. When the elephants charge out, you have to break ranks and form a path. And let the elephants just march straight to the rear, through your ranks. On your way to the rear, all the riders of the elephants were killed, by the way. Basically, the men were standing shoulder to shoulder like hoplites did, but when the elephants charged, broke open the ranks, formed a pathway, the elephants went down a path, and the riders were killed, and the elephants went harmless into the rear, and the elephant charge was completely ineffective. Then Hannibal had to face a superior army that had not been hurt by the elephant charge. He was counting heavily on his elephant charge. But the elephant charge hadn't hurt the enemy. Hannibal had to face his enemy who outnumbered him. Hannibal lost. For the first time in his life, he lost a major battle. And Hannibal was forced into exile way down deep in the heart of the Sahara Desert. Hannibal eventually found his way. I mean, there was quite a bit more to Hannibal. Hannibal went to Greece to try to stir up action against Rome, but he failed there. He went to Syria to try to get those Syrians interested in fighting the Romans. But he failed there. To make a long story short, Hannibal was unable to defeat Rome. Well, many years went by after the Second War, and finally there came the Third War, which occurred about 100 years after the First War. And this time Rome said, we are tired of fighting these wars against. This time Rome went into the city of Carthage, burned the city to the ground, sowed the ground, put salt in the ground to make sure it would not be productive, and sold all the Carthaginians into slavery, because these were people they could not make allies out of. These were people who simply would not quit fighting. Try as you might, you cannot placate them. All right. Folk, I'm hesitant to make the comparison, but is there anything that we're reading about and we're talking about that might be applicable to the year 2015? In the year 2015, we're fighting against an enemy that will not quit fighting. And what do you do for it with them, ultimately? Folk, I'm going to jump to the year 2015 anyway. We're not going to win the war we're fighting. Fighting with our politically correct attitudes. We're going to have to break our own politically correct laws. In World War II, we took all the Japanese we could find a country to put in a camp and kept them there throughout the war. Today we condemn ourselves. Oh, this was naughty, this was evil. We won. It's the way wars are fought. General Sherman went through the city of Atlanta 140 or so years ago and burned the ground, and he made it march the sea and pulled up every railroad that he could get his hands on and bent the rails to where they couldn't be bent back, and burnt an area a mile wide to split the state of Georgia into and split the Confederacy into the North Lawn. It's called war, folk. Today we don't know how to fight it. During World War II, I mean, I want to tell you how evil war can be. We had broken the German code, and we knew where the Germans were going to hit us. On a certain day, the British government under Churchill knew that a certain city was going to be hit. If Churchill had warned the people of that city to flee, he would have let the Germans know they were in under code, and Germans would change the code. Churchill allowed that city to be hit, and hundreds of civilians were killed. When the civilian population found out some 40 years later, a bunch of them were upset. You mean you let my parents die? Well, in one word, this is war. And it's the only way it can be fought. Now, if you don't like what I'm saying, I got something to tell you. I don't like what I am saying either. Right, anybody make any comment? At least it looked like to me on a sleepy day when it's raining outside, everybody seemed awake and attentive. I'm glad to see everybody was listening carefully, and I'm really glad to see that. If you have a comment, if you don't like what I'm saying, you're welcome to say so. I don't like it either. But folks, it's war. It's the way it's made. The Romans, they had been able to placate all their enemies on the Italian soil, and get them on their side. And, they came to Carthage, and folks, you can't get an agreement with people like that. You simply can't. All right. When I was at Lockheed, I worked with an older lady who somewhat was like a mother to me, but there was one problem. She was liberal, I was conservative. But she would tell me, no, you have to learn how to resolve your differences. Well, I've come to the conclusion, okay, what? All right. The issue we were talking about was in my personal life. I mean, I dated a girl one time who was determined that I was not going to go to graduate school. Right? She wasn't going. She was going to make sure that she loved it. I tried to talk to her, and I couldn't. What did I do? I wound up kicking her out of my life before you read school anyway. Now, she's done it. Now, John, you should have learned how to come to some conclusion. What agreement can you come to? You just go out and say, well, you could have just simply not gone. No. Hey, this is what I want to do in my life. I want to be a college teacher. So as a man, I mean, you've got to do what you choose to do. And if some woman stands in your way, she's got to go. All right. What I'm getting at is there are certain issues. Okay, like in the case, all right, now back to more political. The conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The Arab neighbors say that Israel should all be killed. Israel should no longer exist. Now, what kind of agreement can the Israelis come to? Should they agree that, well, half of us will be killed and let the other half live? Is that order that all of us be half killed? Should all of them be half killed, in other words, weakened, crippled severely and half, or is it just simply that they simply cannot possibly come to any kind of agreement? What kind of agreement can you come to with people like that? All right, I've done all the talking. Anybody? I mean, at least I ought to say you all are and you're all listening. All right. I mean, to me, every time I come to this part of the story, I bring this up. They were fighting against the people whom they fought for 100 years. And finally decided, well, we've had enough of this. And they put the Carthage they finally decisively and permanently defeated Carthage. The war I'm talking about has been going on for 1,400 years. 1,400 years. We'll talk about it in chapter 7. Now, if you're afraid to speak up, folk, I've got to tell you something. You can't be more scared of this topic than I am. Nobody wants to talk. All right, everybody, at least you're listening. I'll hand it to you. At least I think you heard every word I said. All right. Yeah, the Third Punic War was fought 50 years after the Second, by the way. Anyway, Rome annexed Carthage after a while, conquered them. And one of you just have asked you, why did the ancient peoples want to conquer other peoples? I don't know if you got that question or not. Again, in some cases, folks, they had to. It was either keep fighting them or conquer them outright. Today, conquest is looked on as being, oh, it's awful. We shouldn't do that to other people. All right. So, Rome, now once it had conquered Carthage, it had much of them. It had all of North Africa. It had Spain. It had southern France. And it had, of course, all of Italy. So it had part of the, so basically Rome was to conquer the known world, the Western world, in 3 stages. The first stage was conquering Italy. The second stage was defeating and conquering Carthage and getting the Western Mediterranean. Then they went into the East. And they didn't conquer the East all at once, but they first, of course, ran into Greece, and they defeated Greece. And then they went into Syria and defeated Syria. And at one point, the king of Pergamum, oh yes, I must mention this. The king of Pergamum, when he was dying, he willed his crown to Rome. He said, I know Rome is going to get my territory anyway. We don't have the army big enough to fight him. So when he died, his crown went to Rome. His territory went to Rome peacefully. And Pergamum is one of the city-states in Asia Minor. And this king is remembered for peacefully giving over his crown to Rome. Here's another somewhat sad part of the story, and again, I think a lot of this applies. The Roman Republic did not last. Its downfall was not sudden. Now, again, to just simply tell you in one sentence what happened, a strong person took over. I mean, now I'm going into more detail, but essentially, I mean, if you know anything about newspaper writing, folks, the headline tells a story, and the first sentence verifies the headline. Then you unfold the story. So the headline is, the Roman Republic fell. It fell when a strong man took over. But now, okay. Now, here is what happened. The Senate began to exercise a tremendous amount of power during the wars. Now, folk, During our time of war, we give our president a lot of power. You may or may not be aware of it, but during the time that we were fighting our Civil War, American democracy was largely suspended. Abraham Lincoln ruled with more power than George III had ever exercised. George III, you know, was the King of England that we rebelled against. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. He jailed people without giving a reason. He had a reason. He suspected they were Confederates and Confederate sympathizers, but but he did not have proof. He just kept people in jail without proof. I'm not knocking it. This is what has to be done in time of war. And free speech was curtailed. Woodrow Wilson jailed persons who spoke against the war. And so did Franklin Roosevelt. So did Winston Churchill in World War II. Free speech is curtailed. Now, I'll say this. In Vietnam War, we did not curtail free speech. And folk, we lost. It was said that the North Vietnamese went through a period of discouragement. They thought, how can we whip the United States? China was not helping them. Russia was not even pretending to help them. And they were having to fight the United States alone. And they said, how can we ever whip the United States? Then they noticed our college students rebelling on campuses. They said to one another, hey, if we can just hold out long enough, their college students will get their government to quit fighting. And that's exactly what happened. So, wartime. Democracy was suspended. More power was given to the Senate. The Senate then began to pass their power on to their sons and their grandsons. So they became then like hereditary nobility. And they became a small, powerful minority. And again, there was no constitution that would limit their power. Also, a lot of your ordinary people. Now, in the days when we were fighting in Italy, this young man would go off and join the army, and he'd stay in the army during the summer season, come back in the fall, and come back to his home. Okay, fine and dandy. But then came the Punic Wars, where the wars lasted year in and year out, and year in and year out, and soldiers would be gone for many, many years, and come home and find that his wife had been unable to keep up the farm. Oftentimes, too, these soldiers would come home missing an arm or a leg or crippled up in some way and unable to work anymore. And basically, most of them lost their, not all, but a lot of them lost their farms. Not to mention, this happens in every war. A soldier will come home and find his wife has been taken up with another man or married to another man. This kind of thing went on. And of course, also, the soldiers would sometimes take up with another woman while they were away, too. So it went both ways. So the land then found its way in the hands of the few wealthy. The very wealthy would buy up the land. And this would meant that the Romans had very, very large farms, and your small, ordinary farmer could not compete. Now, we have that in this country right now, where the typical American farmer is a millionaire, and he has $1 million worth of property and assets. He might be deep in debt, but at least he has, on paper, he's worth $1 million. And your small farmer has long ago been forced out of business. Marginal farmers, so most of your small farmers wound up getting jobs at the factory or some other thing, taking up something else. A lot of soldiers found their farms so deteriorated, they would often sell their farms rather than try to restore them because, I'm too weak, too old, and too tired and too sick to restore this old farm, and I think I'll sell it. All right, so you had very large farms and very few small farmers left. So your ordinary person was left without a source of income. Into this scenario steps two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, G-R-A-C-C, I think I ought to spell it with an H, C-C-H. Tiberius was the oldest, Gaius was the younger one. These were senators, but they had something unique among their fellow upperclassmen. They wanted to help the poor. So Tiberius went before the Senate, and he said to the Senate, I think that our government should reclaim a lot of these public lands that's not being used by the new landowners at bottom, and we should redistribute these lands to the poor. Folk, in another example, this is one of the more famous examples of history where someone proposed, did not actually do it, but proposed taking land from the rich and redistributing this land among the poor. And folk, I challenge any of you to ever find an instance where this has actually worked. Now, in the case of Rome, they didn't actually do it. Instead, some senators got together, and folk, here's the way they played politics in those days. They got together because they had some lands and they were afraid, hey, this might pass the Senate if we're not careful, because a lot of people were in favor of it. They killed Tiberius Gracchus. Well, Tiberius' younger brother took it up. And he went before the Senate thinking, they killed my older brother, but this was an unpopular move, they won't kill me. And he proposed that land be redistributed to the poor, the displaced farmers. Also, Gaius Gracchus knew that there were a lot of new wealth. This has been an issue that civilization had. You always have people who started out poor and accumulated a lot of wealth. Like John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie, who were not part of the original establishment. He said, I think these new wealthy people should be included in the government also. So he even went farther than his older brother had done. A bunch of Roman senators got together and they assassinated him also. Political hardball. About political assassinations. Now, folks, if you read the right books and look at the right YouTube videos, they will tell you that there's a possibility that the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. were all part of a political plot by their political enemies to do away with them. And I'm not saying they were or were not. There's some things about all this. The assassination of all three men is kind of weird. They all three had made a bunch of enemies along the way. But at least if it was, it was covered up. But in these days, I'm talking about, the political assassination was done out in the open, and there was no attempt at cover up, no attempt at hiding. Again, some of you might have read about Kennedy and the Kennedy brothers' assassination and the assassination of Martin Luther King. And King's family has a strong suspicion that James Earl Ray did not do it, and I don't know what the final outcome of that will be. Someday we might all know the truth. But anyway, political assassination has been an issue down through the ages, and a way that people sometimes solve their differences. Now, in the meantime, though, while this was going on, the Romans could not decide on what to do in their homeland. Their army was suffering some defeats in North Africa. Well, into this scenario came a general named Marius. Marius was fighting in France. He was fighting against the Celts who were occupying France. And the Celts folk are a mystery people. We don't know a whole lot about them, but they seem to, we don't know what their origin was, where they came from. But anyway, they were around in Scotland, they were around in Great Britain, and they were around in northern France, and maybe even dipped into Spain. Anyway, a couple hundred years earlier, the Celts had sacked Rome. But anyway, General Marius went into France and defeated the Celtic army. When he got back to Rome, since he was the only victorious general that Rome had at that point, his power and influence became really, really high. So high that it was dangerous for a Republican form of government. Now again, you may not realize just how much people sometimes want to honor their victorious generals. We have made several victorious generals president, including George Washington, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Ulysses Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, and most recently Dwight Eisenhower. These were victorious generals in times of war who went on to become president. But General Marius was very, very influential. And they said, well, hey, what you need to do, you need to go to North Africa and fight there. Well, General Marius realized, hey, I've won in Gaul, but it's going to be tough for North Africa. So he began to do what had not been done before. He began to recruit troops who were not Roman citizens in order to raise an army. Now, it'd be like And folks, this was something that's eventually believed to have eventually destroyed the Roman Empire. It destroyed the Republic before it destroyed the Empire. Now, to avoid confusion, Rome had two falls. There was first the fall of the Republic and then the fall of the Empire. But in both cases, the Roman army began to recruit troops who were not citizens. Now, our own army has not resorted to that yet, but our army is resorting to finding paid volunteers, and if we get to where we can't get enough of our own citizens to join, who knows, we might start hiring Mexicans and Guatemalans and Latin Americans and even Russian and Chinese troops to fight in our army. I'm not saying we'll ever do that, but that's basically what the Romans did. Marius hired foreign troops to fight in the army, and he did something else that was really dangerous. Now, folks, I joined the army in 1979, and when I did, I put one hand on the Bible, raised my other hand toward heaven, and I swore an oath of loyalty to, not to President Jimmy Carter, who was president at that time. I swore an oath of loyalty to the United States government. General Marius had the troops swear an oath of loyalty to him, Marius himself. No, Furion swearing an oath of loyalty to the Roman Senate. Furion swearing an oath of loyalty to the Roman Republic. You swear your oath of loyalty that you're going to follow me. Very, very dangerous. And so basically he was doing two things that were dangerous. Recruiting troops that were not citizens and having troops to swear an oath of loyalty to him. And he promised the troops, now if you serve me and if we win, I'll give you land. Well, this put a whole lot of power in the hands of the generals because Marius and the other generals had to play politics to get the land that they promised the troops. Well, in the meantime, some people in Rome became a little bit concerned about how much power Marius had, so another general was raised up. Now, there was a difference between each. I did not mention this before, but I mean, now, Marius started out as a poor man who became rich by his merits. Sulla was born into wealth. So Sulla was of the old aristocracy. The Senate called on Sulla to lead a campaign far off in Turkey, or what is today was then called Asia Minor. Well, while Sulla was away in Asia Minor fighting, the plebeians tried to transfer all the power of the army to Marius, basically trying to get Marius to take over. Sulla then came back from his campaign in Asia Minor to fight Marius. Marius and Sulla fought a civil war in which Sulla won. And then Sulla captured Rome itself. Sulla then became a dictator. Now the Roman Republic was not quite dead, but it almost was. Sulla became a dictator. He made Rome less republican and more autocratic than it had been. Autocratic means more ruled by one person, autocrat. And he had set the example that later rulers were going to follow. Well, after Sulla, there followed a 50-year period in which the person who got the power was the person who'd won the most fights. Basically, they would fight each other. This went on for about 50 years, and it finally led to three men called the First Triumvirate. These three men were Julius, Crassus, and Pompey. Well, actually, the order I give: Crassus, Pompey, Julius. All right. Now, I've got Julius's name here last, but I'll tell you up front, again, my wife's a newspaper reporter, but ultimately this man is going to win. He winds up winning. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, and in those days, something else, he had a large army. Now, folks, this is something else that was a big problem with the Romans. A lot of your rich people had their own armies. Can you imagine a world where Ted Turner has his own personal army and another rich person over here, owner of the New York Yankees, has his, I mean, it's one thing if you have your own personal baseball team or your own personal football team, but imagine a world where every state has its own rich man, and each one of these rich men have their own army, and sometimes these armies clash. Where Crassus, being the richest man in Rome, had an army. Pompey had an army. Well, these three men ruled for a while, together peacefully. Now, Crassus went to the Far East to finish the job of conquering the Far East that Sulla had not been able to do. But Crassus was killed in battle, so he's out of the way. That left Pompey and Julius. Well, to get rid of Julius, they sent Julius to France. France at this time was known as Gaul. They sent him to Gaul. And there Julius Caesar, we later called Caesar, conquered Gaul. And he sent back a report that consists of 3 Latin words. Does anybody remember how to pronounce them? 3 Latin words. It means I came, I saw, I conquered. They go something like Vina Vita Vici. Anybody know enough Latin to say it better than I just did? Anyway, he sent back a message, 3 words. I came, I saw, I conquered. He conquered Gaul. Well, Pompey was still in Rome. And the fact of the matter is, the whole Roman Empire was not big enough for the 2 of them. Now, Julius Caesar then had to decide what he was going to do. The Senate feared Caesar more than they did Pompey. So they told Julius Caesar, lay down your arms and come home and retire as a private citizen. Caesar had a choice, so he thought, if I comply, they'll probably kill me. So he said, in fact, I'm not going to comply. So he began to march toward Rome. As he marched to Rome, he crossed the Rubicon River, and it became an expression, I've crossed Rubicon. Because when he crossed Rubicon, once the last of his troops were crossed, he told us, all you do is stop right here, turn around, and burn the bridge you just crossed. And that led to the saying, burn my bridges behind me. You know, it basically is telling his men, we're either going to conquer Rome or we're going to die doing it, or we're not going to retreat. Now Cortez was to do the same thing. When Cortez went to Mexico, he told his men, now burn all your ships. You know, we're either going to conquer Mexico or we're going to die trying. But we're not going to retreat. So Cortez's men burned their ships, just like Julius Caesar burned the bridge that crossed the Rubicon River. And he marched on toward Rome. He clashed with Pompey, and Julius Caesar, being the better military commander, won and was made dictator. And a few years later, they made him dictator for life. I mean, after all, he was in charge. And at this point, the Roman Republic was over. The Roman Republic had ended. With Crassus being killed in battle, Pompey being defeated, and Julius Caesar coming out on top, this time Julius Caesar made little pretense that the days of the Republic were over. Now, democracy had failed at this point, and it was to be, many, many generations. It would be 1,000 years before England was to try to start the long road back to democracy again. And folk, I will say this about democracy. It will only work if the enemy, if your nearest enemy is far, far, far away. When Abraham Lincoln had to contend with an enemy who was less than 50 miles from the capital city of Washington, our democracy, at least most of it, went out the window. If we had enemies, if Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and South Carolina were all enemies, none of these places could afford to have a democracy. But we've been united, and our nearest enemies have been far across the ocean most of the time, so we can have a democracy. But if Europe had been located just across the river from Georgia and just across the river from New Jersey and Massachusetts, folks, it's doubtful that we would have ever developed our democracy. Democracy cannot work when you have the enemy just on the other side of the hill from you, and you have to watch him all the time. Anyway, now, Julius Caesar, I want to elaborate on him a little bit. he made a calendar called the Julian calendar that was in use for some 500 years. Now, what was wrong with the Julian calendar, he didn't realize, it was after a certain amount of time it was going to become obsolete. It, for instance, did not have leap years. Well, you may not realize how important leap years are, but the purpose of leap years, folks, is to keep the equinoxes and solstices falling approximately the same day every year. Now, ever since the year 2000, our fall equinox, the fall equinox means the sun crossed the equator, is always September 22nd or 23rd. When I was a kid, it often was September 21st. It's going to be 100 years before it's September 21st again. Because again, making the year 2000 a leap year pushed the calendar back. I mean, pushed it down a little bit. But now see, if we didn't have these leap years, we would lose 24 days a century. And after 200 years, we lose 48 days. And after 300 years, we lose about 72 days. What it would amount to is after 500 or 600 years, we'd be singing I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas on December 25th when outside the temperature might be 100 degrees. If you follow along, you have to keep the solstices and equinoxes occurring at the same time. That's why I put leap years in the calendar. After about 600 years, they realized the Julian calendar was wrong, and they made the Gregorian calendar, which we still use. Pope Gregory the Great changed the calendar. The month of July was named after him, and he made sure it was going to be one of the long months by making it a 31-day month. And the next one, Caesar Augustus, named the month of August after himself and chopped a day from February. He thought February was an unlucky month, to make February a short month and make his month of August as long as the month of July is. So that's why August has 31 days. And July also has 31 days. Two emperors back to back have added their names to the calendar and want to make sure that their months are as long as the others. Julius Caesar might have been paranoid. There is a record that he was epileptic. But it was said that when Cicero, all right, I'm going to introduce you to Roman. There was one great Roman philosopher was named Cicero. It was said that when Cicero spoke to the Senate, Julius Caesar noticeably trembled. Why? Because Cicero got up and said, private citizens should not have armies. Armies should belong to the state. The best form of government is democracy. And persons who take over and destroy the democracy can expect to be destroyed themselves. And of course, this is Julius Caesar said, oops, I have had a private army all my life, and I have and he's foretelling judgment on me. It shook him up. Now, he might have been paranoid somewhat, even though a lot of his fears actually were founded because what actually happened to him. Now, he also studied the Great Pyramid of Egypt. He married the Queen of Egypt, Queen Cleopatra. And about 50 years ago, there was a movie made about this marriage. Queen Cleopatra married Julius Caesar, and they had a son called Caesarion, who never became emperor, by the way. Yes? Cleopatra married Julius Caesar. In the movie, Richard Burton played Julius Caesar and Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra. They already happened to see the movie. Okay, yeah, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra. Cleopatra thought she was on top of the world. Cleopatra, by the way, was the heir to Egypt's throne. She was a descendant of Ptolemy, the last of the Ptolemy family. And she managed to outmaneuver her brother and get the throne herself, the only woman in Egypt to do so. So basically, this made Julius Caesar the ruler of Egypt also. So Caesar now had almost all of the Mediterranean world. But it came to an abrupt end. Now, your book used to have this story in it, but since then, the later edition has taken it out. I don't know why. But the story is that Julius Caesar, on his way to a Senate meeting, passed by a blind soothsayer, who was a beggar. The blind soothsayer said, on the Ides of March, you are going to die. The Ides of March is the 15th day of March, by the way. There's nothing significant about that date except on that day Julius Caesar died. Anyway, Caesar, a few days later, was the Ides of March, and he went to the Senate and saw this blind soothsayer. Hey, it's the Ides of March, and I'm still around. The blind soothsayer said, the Ides of March are not over yet. Now, what Julius Caesar did not know was that about 24 men had gotten together and plotted assassination, and they stuck daggers under their cloaks. And from this we get the expression cloak and dagger. But they had their daggers under their cloaks, and they had planned it. They said, now, okay, now you 6 men, you get in front of him, whichever way he's pointing, you get to stand in front of him. And you 6 men, now you get on his left, and you 6, you go, and you 6, you get behind him. Now, the leader said, now, I'm going to say out loud a certain phrase. When I say this certain phrase, we all pull out our daggers. So they were all standing around the Senate pretending to be just chatting away, but actually all the 24 assassins were getting themselves in positions while talking to other senators, some of whom were not even part of the plot. Then when the leader gave the right signal, all 24 men pulled out their daggers, and they started lunging for Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar tried to defend himself, and his last words, he looked around and saw that his friend Brutus was among them. He said, "Et tu, Brute," which is Latin for "you too, Brutus." Then he just simply bowed over and resigned himself to his fate and suffered more than 40 stab wounds, which killed him. Again, from this comes the expression, "Et tu, you too, Brutus," or cloak and dagger. And Julius Caesar then was assassinated, somewhat like Cicero had, we might say, foretold, even though Cicero did not claim to be a prophet. And a lot of persons thought the Republic was going to end. Now, I'll say this, folks. My wife once told me she had read it. Everybody who has ever assassinated a leader winds up saying they wish they hadn't done it. They believe that everybody's against this leader. I mean, the man who assassinated James Garfield thought that everybody would really praise him for assassinating. Instead, everybody condemned him soundly, and everybody was after his hide. He wound up being hung for it. Most of the time, they wind up regretting it. The men who killed Julius Caesar found that the Roman people did not want him dead as much as they thought they had, and they wound up fleeing, and all of them wound up dying violent deaths. Particularly Brutus wound up being caught eventually, and he himself was executed for the crime of killing Julius Caesar. Cleopatra went back to Egypt with her son, where she joined up. All right, three men took over in what we call the Second Triumvirate. 3 men, and they fought war. These men were, let's see, Octavian, who we know as Caesar Augustus, and Mark Antony. I'm going to tell you, they're just 2 men involved. Mark Antony and Octavian. Octavian, we know of him as Caesar Augustus. He was the one who eventually won. But meantime, Cleopatra believed Mark Antony was going to win, so she allied herself with Mark Antony. And they fought another civil war. And in this civil war, Mark Antony lost, Octavian won, and Octavian took the title of Caesar Augustus, and he was destined to rule for 45 years. All right. He realized that he'd better claim to be restoring the Republic if he was to survive. He didn't want what happened to him to happen to, he didn't want what happened to Julius Caesar to happen to him. He was an adopted son of Julius Caesar, so he was related, but he was not a blood relative. He was an adopted son. And he pretended that he had restored the Republic. In actual reality, he was the sole ruler. When it came to the meetings, he would not sit at the head of the table. He would sit among the princeps as one of the princes. And from his we get our word prince. So he would just sit down among them like he was one of them. But in actual reality, everybody knew that he was really in charge, and what he said went. But he made a pretense that he was restoring the Republic. Now, to protect himself, something that Julius Caesar had not seen a need to, he set up the Praetorian Guard. I won't write that down, but basically he set up the guard, and these guards were to follow him everywhere he went, including even in the Senate. So when he went to the Senate, he had some armed guards around him to help to guarantee that what had happened to Julius Caesar would not happen to him. Caesar Augustus. Under him, Rome became powerful. Rome had by this time conquered all the Mediterranean. And Rome was set up to rule the Western world for about 300 more years. Now, he went back to recruiting Italians to the army instead of recruiting just anybody. And he also made a law that only he could have an army. He did not allow every rich man in the country to hold an army, that he was the government and only he could hold an army, could command an army. Well, actually, he appointed generals, but basically everybody knew he was the commander. So troops swore their loyalty to the state and not to him. However, he made a few mistakes. One of his big mistakes, when he realized that there were a whole lot of idle poor. Now, this word idle, I've had students, what does that mean? The word idle, by the way, will appear on your past 3. The word idle means people who don't have anything to do because they're unemployed. Rome had a whole lot of idle poor people, and Julius Caesar's solution was, well, if we feed them and entertain them, they'll be all right. It's called bread and circuses. And this was the beginning of feeding these idle poor people and keeping them entertained. And these people were fed, by the way, at government expense. This was the beginning of a government welfare program that a lot of people believe was eventually to bring Rome tumbling down. Bread and circuses, idle poor people who lived in the poor sections of Rome, and nobody knew when they might just break out and start looting and rioting. He made that mistake. Now, he made another mistake. He tried to conquer Germany. He sent an army, he didn't go himself, he sent an army up to Germany, and the army was annihilated. And in his weakest moments, he would be seen going to the halls just crying, "Give me back my army, give me back my army." I mean, it really hurt him. So he made a law that nobody was to ever try to conquer Germany again. Well, a later emperor broke this law, and Germany was at least partially conquered. But folks, the people whom Rome did not conquer wound up conquering them. Now, Caesar Augustus saw that Rome was declining, and he tried to stop the decline. He tried to restore the old morality because in his day, divorce was becoming a big, strong issue that formerly it had not been. And of course, to set an example, without him meaning to, he wound up divorcing his own wife. But he tried to stem the tide of excessive divorces. He tried to outlaw adultery, but bringing heavy fines on persons who committed adultery. He limited the amount of money that could be spent on parties. There was a big problem the Romans were having. They were going into these parties that would last 2 or 3 days, and they would drink and eat heavily. Then when they had drunk their full, and this might sound gross, I'm sorry, but they would go out to the nearest latrine, regurgitate what they'd drunk, and eat. Then they'd go back and eat and drink some more. And this, of course, we know is really hard on their stomach because this is believed to have shortened their lives to where they only lived an average of 30-some years. But he tried to limit the number of the amount of money that was spent on parties. He also taxed persons who were unmarried, taxed them heavily, and taxed couples who did not have children more heavily than. And basically, it did what we do today. He gave taxes exemptions to couples who had children. These laws were enforced, but they did not stem the tide. Divorce continued to increase, and adultery continued to be a big problem, but at least he tried to limit it. And parties still became a really big problem. The laws then had little effect. Also, now, I'm going to say too, because we'll be talking about this man next time for sure. He was the Caesar when Jesus was born. If the book of Luke mentions the Christmas story, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the Roman world should be taxed. He was the one who made a decree that forced everybody to be taxed and got Mary and Joseph to go back to the city of Bethlehem, the city of Joseph's and Mary's ancestors, to pay the tax. So, while they were there, Jesus was born. But he was a Caesar during the birth of Jesus, but not during Jesus' public career. He lived for 45, he ruled for 45 years, lived to be about 65, died of natural causes. When he died, he turned his throne over to his adopted son, Tiberius. Now, about Tiberius, again, I want to emphasize that a lot of these Roman emperors would pick a promising young boy and groom him for the emperorship instead of picking their own sons. And a lot of times the reason that was their own sons just simply did not measure up to their standards. So they picked some young boy who did and groom him. Tiberius was an adopted son of Caesar Augustus, and Caesar Augustus groomed him for the empire. And so when Caesar Augustus died, all pretense of democracy was done away with. And for all practical purposes, dynastic rule was the thing. Under Tiberius, more and more power was given to the emperor and taken away from the Senate. And also I must mention that Tiberius was the ruler during the public career and during the crucifixion of Christ. For many generations we suspected Tiberius knew nothing about what was going on in Judea. But the last time I researched it, some people were thinking that actually he did know what was going on in Judea and was actually keeping a close watch on the events, and that's why Pontius Pilate was so afraid to crucify Jesus, afraid he had to answer to Tiberius, which eventually Pontius Pilate was called on because of another issue, but Pontius Pilate had to answer Tiberius, and Tiberius ordered him to commit suicide by opening his veins. This was a common method that the emperors used to get rid of high up nobilities, just simply say open your veins and bleed to death in effect. Folk, I mean, you think that our politics today is bad. You think that our morality is bad. You ought to read carefully about what morality was like during Roman times or during Greek times. I mean, it was worse than what it is now. But public morality was, in fact, bad. Now, after Tiberius, you get a few rulers that we won't name. I mean, there's a few more in there. But the one I do want to mention is Nero. Until Saddam Hussein, until Stalin, until Hitler, in other words, until the 20th century, Nero was looked on as being the worst ruler that you could have. In effect, Nero was a member of the royal family, and he never expected to become emperor. He was actually pretty far down the line. But in those days, death hit him, and all the people ahead of him died. Then, last of all, the emperor died, and that left him with the job of being emperor. He actually had taken up art, and he was more interested in art and theater, but all of a sudden, he's emperor. Well, shortly after taking the throne, they bought him an execution order, someone who really deserved to be executed. But because he was a noble person, high up, very high born, only the emperor could sign the order. So they said, Nero, here's an execution order. This man has committed such and such a crime. He's been tried, he's been proven guilty, but you have to sign the order. He said, you mean if I sign this order, this man is going to die? Yes, Your Majesty. I don't want to sign it. Listen, Your Majesty, this is what, as emperor, you have to do. It's part of your job, and it's unpleasant, and you're not used to it, but you'll get used to it. You must sign the order. Nero said, I wish I'd never learned how to write. And he signed the execution order. The man was killed. I said, the first person he had executed probably deserved it, insurrection. In those days, I mean, insurrectionists were always killed. Well, time went on, but before it was over, Nero was signing execution orders, I might say, without any qualm. A big fire occurred in Rome. Now, we do not really know for sure where Nero was during the fire. Some folks say he was out fiddling while Rome burned. Others say no, actually he was out of the city, and when he heard about the fire, he came back in to try to direct the operation of putting the fire out. But whatever, the people of Rome blamed the fire on him. Now, again, the problem Nero had, some people, my graduate advisor at the University of Tennessee said this about Nero. It wasn't that the man was evil, he was just simply incompetent. He was not suited to be emperor. He never wanted to be emperor, never intended to be emperor. And he had the office thrust upon him. Be that as it may, he was very unpopular, and the people of Rome blamed him for starting the fire. Well, there was a new movement that was spreading throughout the empire pretty fast this time, a new movement known as Christianity. And Christianity had found its way in Rome, thanks to the efforts of Peter and Paul. Paul, we know, had been to Rome, and Peter is said to have been there. Nero blamed the fire on the Christians. And Nero then began the first empire-wide persecution of Christians by the Roman government. Before that, Christians had been persecuted locally. But Nero began to persecute Christians by the Roman government. And including Peter and Paul were both believed to have been killed under the rulership of Nero. The people of Rome, though, finally decided they'd had enough of him, and Nero saw he was about to be murdered as everybody was turning against him. So one day he just stabbed himself, and his last words were, "What an artist dies in me." And that was his end. Again, his name has become a symbol of heartless cruelty, not to be exceeded until the days of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Saddam Hussein, and some others who have since somewhat taken away. Now, if you ever see a multiple choice test, and I ask for who were the 5 good emperors, if Nero is one of the choices, pass over that choice. Yeah, okay? Yeah. I mean, after a while, I mean, if you don't know their names, Nero could have ruined Rome, but Rome was pretty substantially settled. All right, now, at this point, we come to the 5 good emperors next in my notes, but we will not get to them today. I'm out of time. Everybody have a good couple of days. First of all, anybody have any questions? Okay, I do need to go over some things. All right, yeah, well, I've got a minute. I want to say this about the past. Well, one of the questions you'll see on the past, everybody listen. Persons sometimes spend more money than they take in. All right, that's the cause. Governments sometimes spend more money than they take in. If governments keep on spending more money than they take in, what happens? I mean, what does happen? Anybody know? The government goes bankrupt. This has happened to many governments in the time past. The government eventually gets to where it can't pay its debts. I mean, okay, that's part of what you call cause and effect. All right.